Do you have a healthy job? It's a funny question, right? But it's a good one. Today's guest is going to share with us how you can and should practice self-care in your career just as in your life. Enjoy today's episode of Dadages.
You know, when I was your age, go ask your mother. I know you don't like it. It builds character. How many times do I have to tell you? I'm not just talking to hear my own voice.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Dadages. I'm your host, Chad Hagle. And if you are looking for some fatherly wisdom for your career, your family, or any other aspect of your life, then you've come to the right place. If you want to learn more about Dadages, find additional content, submit questions, or feedback to me, visit dadages.com. Thanks for being here. And before you listen to our podcast, please listen to your father. Friends and family, welcome back to Dadages. We're joined today by a special guest as we continue our discussion of the adage, good health is not the only thing that matters, but without good health, nothing else matters. Our guest today is author Minda Zetlin. Minda is a career-long writer and is known for the highly popular Laid Back Leader column at Inc.com. You can find her frequently on Insider.com and CNBC.com. She's the author and co-author of several books and a former president of the American Society of Journalists and Authors, or ASJA. And we'll get into that a bit later. Her latest book, Career Self-Care, Find Your Happiness, Success, and Fulfillment at Work, is the primary topic of our discussion today. Minda, welcome to the Dadages virtual studio.
Well, thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's get right into it. I'd like to start right up front. The Dadages friends and family know that I'm quite a linguophile, and I love the instruments of the written language. I published an episode of Dadages a while back focused on the topic of just because you can do something doesn't mean you can. And I devoted a portion of that episode to talking about oxymorons. Many out there would consider the title of your book to be an oxymoron, Career Self-Care. I think most of us believe that those two things are completely opposite and that we must actually take time away from our work to practice self-care. Can you tell us why you disagree with that premise and what the title of your book really means?
I totally can tell you why. And I think particularly since the years of the pandemic, people are waking up a little bit about this. But there's all kinds of research that shows that working harder, all the things we think we do when we're trying to be more productive, a lot of them are actually counterproductive. For example, multitasking, that's an obvious thing that a lot of people, I think hopefully now people know about this, but in fact, our brains don't actually multitask. What they do is they context switch. So if you think that you're, let's say, writing a blog post while also at the same time participating in a meeting that you're supposed to be in, what you're actually doing is not two things at the same time. You're switching from the blog post to the meeting and back and forth. It's very inefficient, but it also feels very good because it is the opposite of boredom. Your brain has something new to grasp every single moment. So that's one of the cases where what feels good to our brain is actually not good for us and not good for our productivity. That's a pretty commonly known instance of this, but in a similar way, working all the time, working too many hours, working 7 days a week, which is something I used to do and learned the hard way to cut out, is all of that is equally counterproductive for your brain. So you feel like you're working really hard, you're getting a whole lot done, but in fact, you're not using your brain to its optimum. And that means you're losing out on a lot of creativity and perspective. So even to do your job better, let alone the question of why you're working this hard and whether it's making you happy or a better person in the world, better person in your own life. Even if you take that piece out of it altogether and just say, how do I do my job best? Building in rest and breaks and not overworking yourself is actually the way to do your job well. And if you think about like the most famous, most successful people that we've known, and we'll take Elon Musk out because he's an anomaly in many ways, but pretty much everyone else, Steve Jobs used to go home at 5.
Yeah, I think taking Elon Musk out of the equation is a very wise choice. I don't think his brain works exactly like any of the rest of us, for sure. And thank you for introducing the example of multitasking. In that very same episode I referred to a couple minutes ago, just because you can do something doesn't mean you can. we really focused on the difference between capability and capacity, and how while you might be capable of doing something, you can actually diminish your own capacity by making unwise choices about how you're implementing your work and implementing your engagement with your team and people you work with. And in your book, you shared some pretty stark examples of how really unhealthy career choices and pathways can impact someone's life. Can you share one or a couple of those dramatic stories with the Dadages friends and family?
Sure. So I opened the book with the story of Bavaram, who used to be named Rod Willis, who I interviewed years ago. And his story really stuck with me because it's so emblematic of how so many of us, including me, a lot of the time operate. He was a very ambitious TV journalist. And his motto for getting ahead was this: I'm going to work harder and longer than anyone else. And how many of us have gone into it with that? And it is true that by working hard, we get ahead. And by working harder than others, often we get ahead a little faster. But like everything, it needs to be done in balance. And he got way out of balance. So things came crashing down for him, literally, actually, when he was about to start a really exciting new job at a national TV network. And in the week before he's starting this new job, he went on vacation in the Caribbean somewhere. There was a storm. He was climbing up on top of something to try and close the very tall windows in his hotel room because the wind was whipping around. And he slipped and he fell and he landed on his back and he cracked his spine. But he had this new job to start. His doctor told him he needed surgery. There would be 4 weeks of recovery. Unacceptable. I'm supposed to start this new job. I have to be a go-getter. I have to be out there. They have to know I'm tough. So he toughed it out for years. But because he was in constant pain, he wound up taking a lot of painkillers. He wound up drinking a lot of alcohol because that numbed the pain. He went on like that for a while until one day in the Philippines, actually looking at some video, he leaned the wrong way and it broke the rest of the way. And things really came crashing down for him from there. He also got diagnosed with cancer. He figured his life was over. He was in horrific pain. At some point, he decided, though, to stand up to his pain and started doing yoga, became a yogi, became a yoga instructor, and had a whole second career as Bavaram. But I always thought, and I imagined in my book, what if all the way back then when he first injured himself, he had said, look, I am more than excited to start this job, but I have this injury and we need to delay things for 4 weeks. During those 4 weeks of recuperation, I will study everything that there is to know about your company and this job. And when I come along in 4 weeks, I am going to be so ready to go, you won't believe it. You know, what would have happened? An optimist enough about human nature to think that that would have worked. But I also think, the amazing thing about Bavaram, when I think about the story and why I put it in my book, is this guy, his ambition was to go into war zones, and he did. He walked among drug lords in South America. He went into every frightening battle zone that you can imagine, but he wouldn't take the time off to take care of himself because he was afraid that would put him behind. That's where his courage failed him. And I think that it's so amazing. We think about courage and we don't necessarily have the courage to be honest with ourselves and do what's right for us.
Yeah, it's such a powerful story. I was thinking as you were telling part of that story that they always say that doctors make the worst patients, but it sounds like obsessive newsmen may be even worse.
Maybe even worse, yeah.
But it's certainly a powerful story, and it's a very, very obvious example. And I think that many of us listening to that story would say, oh, gosh, that's terrible. I definitely would have performed that self-intervention that you're talking about and would have gotten off of that train before it left the station. But perhaps it's not that simple. And those of us that can look at that example and see it may not necessarily be as insightful when we look in the mirror and look at our own career. Can you help us and the Dadages friends and family better understand what makes for a healthy professional life, and conversely, what makes for an unhealthy professional life, and how can we see it for ourselves in our own lives?
Right. And I think we all do that, as I said, including me. I think I wrote about this in the book. I've definitely written about it in my column. There was a point where I overworked myself to where my husband and I were both exposed to the same pathogen, and he got bronchitis and I got pneumonia. I actually I took my temperature, realized I had 102 fever, actually sat down at my computer and sent out some emails to cancel the things I was supposed to do that day before I said, okay, I've got 102 fever. You got to take me to the doctor. And that turned out to be a really tough one for me because I had, at the time, my parents, my mother and stepfather actually, who have now both passed away, were still alive, but they were very late in their lives, and their health was declining. And my mother in particular had dementia. And my stepsister was their kind of 24-hour-a-day caretaker, but she had lost a good friend of hers. She needed to go to a memorial service. And so I was scheduled to come and relieve her for that coming weekend. There was no way I could go stay with people who were in their 90s while carrying pneumonia. I mean, even if I could do it physically, which wasn't clear either, there was no way. So I had to make one of the most saddest phone calls of my life to say, I'm so sorry. I can't. And that made me really kind of angry at myself that I had let myself get to that point. So it is subtle. I mean, Bavaram's story is great because it's such a clear, obvious, fall down, injure yourself. But by little steps, we can do this to ourselves too.
Certainly a slippery slope and can be challenging for those of us that are experiencing it and living it in real time sometimes to take notice. But I think one of the things that I love in chapter 1 of your book is that you really do highlight the importance of sticking up for yourself. And I appreciate the ownership for self-care that you express. And the title of that chapter 1 is Taking Care of Yourself is a Radical Act. And we recently had an awesome discussion on Dadages with Dr. Todd Kashdan, who is kind of a world-renowned specialist in insubordination and dissent. And I think Todd would definitely agree with your perspectives about individuals taking responsibility for themselves and their own well-being in a professional setting, even when that might go against the grain. You wrote that giving yourself the care you need is your responsibility and no one else's. Can you explain why taking care of yourself is a radical act and the importance of taking this on as a responsibility as an individual?
I think it hopefully more and more depends on the nature of the workplace that you're in. But you see so much of unhealthy thinking, and I really literally mean unhealthy thinking around workplaces. For example, I think that the pandemic might have changed this thinking, but I'm not even sure. There used to be a really commonly seen television commercial for cold remedies, and what it would show is, oh my God, I'm too sick to get out of bed. Oh, I took this pill. Oh, yay, I'm great. Here I am at my desk working away, right? Now, first of all, that's very questionable for you. Second of all, that's not good for your workplace, is it? And yet, right? Because now instead of one person who's impaired and not able to work at 100%, you might have 10 or more, depending on what they do. So why would an employer push someone to come to work when they're sick? Are they thinking ahead? Do they not really believe that they're sick? If you have employees that you distrust to that degree, that's a whole other problem. So many of our workplaces are set up to push people to work harder, longer, to be, to have that Bavaram credo, who works the hardest, who works the longest. When I was in my first job, at a trade publishing company, there was a woman who she had gone to Harvard and she dressed really well and she spoke really well and she stayed until, 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And the editorial director once said to me, wow, she's so great. She just never leaves. And what he, I guess, didn't know, but those of us who were her colleagues knew, was that she was actually struggling. She was having a very hard time doing her job, getting her work done. And that was why she was there so late. She just, for whatever reason, she just couldn't quite do the job. But people who look at how long someone works and how hard they appear to be working and don't see what's actually getting done can miss that. And people who don't see the quality of what's actually getting done can miss that. So yes, ultimately, it's up to all of us to stand up for ourselves, to say, I really need to be able to do this or that. I can't come to work. And it's not even, sick. Okay, that's a clear case, but family commitments, even things that you need to do in order to have a complete life. And ultimately, your life is yours and no one else's. And ultimately, a workplace that absolutely refuses to acknowledge that may or may not be a healthy place for you to be.
I agree 100% with everything you're saying. And I want to spend a little bit more time digging deeper into chapter 2 of your book. That chapter was titled The Disappearing Line Between Life and Work. Now, you and I have, at least I think we have, slightly different perspectives on this particular topic. And I love that because I hope that we can have some healthy, friendly debate on the topic in order to explore it a little bit further. You talk in chapter 2 about setting boundaries between your work life and your real life. And when I heard that, the first question that came to my mind is work not real life? And could you please outline better for me and for the friends and family, though, what your perspectives are about the disappearance of the line between life and work and how you've arrived at these perspectives in your research and in your own life?
Let me start by saying I say it that way very deliberately because not only has work bled into our home lives a lot more than it used to, maybe a bit older than you, so I may remember, much more divisions, but also our home lives have bled into work a lot more than they used to. I mean, it used to be, a standard thing. You cannot have a personal phone call at work, right? And that, I think that's gone out the window a long time ago, just as an example. And again, another thing that was accelerated by the pandemic, because all of a sudden, just like you're doing with me right now, we're looking into each other's homes. Now, this is a curated background. If this wasn't an official podcast, there might possibly be a kitten, that would pop her head in. I've locked her out at the moment, but depending, some people, it might be their child or their dog or whatever. We weren't so regularly looking into each other's homes before the pandemic drove us all home for a while, or many of us home. I do just want to say as an aside that I keep wanting to remind myself and everyone else that those of us who are knowledge workers had that experience. But in fact, even at the height of the pandemic, only 50% of Americans were working from home. It's good to keep that in mind. So in this world, that's how our home lives come into our work lives, right? At the same time, how many of us have answered an email at 1 o'clock in the morning for one reason or another, or worked through a weekend, or there was an advertising executive that I brutally took to task in my book, perhaps unfairly, for scheduling a phone call with clients on Thanksgiving. Now, I mean, that if she and the client wanted to do that, I guess that's fine, but there were other members of her team there too. How did they feel about that? I think, though, it's healthy for all of us to set those boundaries because first of all, it allows us to have some perspective on our own lives. It brings up the ability for the brain to rest, for us to focus on other things, for things to happen in the backs of our minds that aren't always on the fore. I mean, there's, again, not to go back to brain research, there's brain research that says that when we focus on something, we problem solve in one way. When we take our focus someplace else, there's still problem solving going on. And sometimes it's really more powerful. Again, it's a kind of a cliche thing that people have their best ideas in the shower. If you think about it, you've probably had a lot of your best ideas at moments when you weren't at work at all, sitting in a kayak or on a long walk. It's important for us to take our attention off work sometimes in order to unleash that perspective and that creativity. And so we need to set those boundaries so that we can be our best at work. It's also important, I think, to set boundaries because at the end of the day, yes, work is absolutely part of real life, especially if you're fortunate enough, like me, and I think you, and hopefully some of the people, at least, or most of the people listening to this, if you have work that you really love, that really feels important to you and feels like it's a true expression of who you are, then of course it's part of life. And it's a real blessing to have that. But you still need to create a separation between that and what your actual life is.
Okay, I hear all of that. Well, I appreciate you bringing up a couple of those examples. One was the Thanksgiving example. And this is one of those things where, for every rule, there's an exception. And then for every exception, you can find a new rule. For me, in the past year, moved my whole business operation to Poland. I love Thanksgiving, but they don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Poland. So guess what? It's a work day for me. And that has changed my life. So, in the past on Dadages, I've shared that I personally reject the notion of work-life balance altogether because I think it's a false paradigm. My work and my life, and as you said, this is a blessing that my work and my life and all of my other pursuits, such as philanthropy, all blend together into one thing, which is simply my life. And I recognize that many people may not benefit from this type of unity and the blessing that I'm talking about in their lives. And that may be something that's completely outside of their control. What I'm interested in asking you is, do you feel that your perspectives on work-life balance apply universally to all professionals? And what I mean by that is, does it only apply in a corporate setting where you're talking about employers and employees or managers with their team members? Or do you think that these perspectives apply to people like me who are entrepreneurs and running their own companies?
I don't think there's any universal right way to do anything. And I also am a solopreneur, right? I'm not running a company, but I have like one very, very part-time employee, but I am, nevertheless a one-person business. I think sometimes I don't think that there's a universal that applies to everyone, but I also think that when you're deep in it, you don't always see the big picture. And I think that speaking as someone who writes for and talks to entrepreneurs quite a lot, I think that happens quite a lot to entrepreneurs. And I still think it's useful to set separations and say, okay, this time I am not working. And I do this for myself because I love my work. Any given moment, and for some reason, especially at this period in my life, I'm doing more and more public speaking, and I'm still doing all the writing I was doing, and I haven't quite gotten it managed. I really have to try and set a boundary for myself. Okay, there's one day a week when I won't go in my office, or if I go in my office maybe to do the taxes, but nothing that's actually work. And I really try, it falls down sometimes, but I really try and preserve that discipline. And it really helped me from that time when I got pneumonia and I was overworking and my husband would tell you, not much fun to live with, to a place where the balance was better and the work went better. I actually became a lot more successful after I did that. So I think it is beneficial to set those boundaries. I also think that since you're running your own company and you're the boss, now it might be sad if there's nobody else around you eating turkey. You could take Thanksgiving and celebrate it that one day for yourself if you wanted to. If it's not a holiday for the other people working for you, then the thing that I objected to that advertising executive did was moot. What bothered me was that she said, "Oh, the pies are cooling and it's a perfectly fine time for me to have a client call. That's great, but not necessarily for the other people who are on the call and had to, interrupt their own Thanksgivings to do it."
Yeah, and looking at it from my own perspective and the impact it has on my life, my philosophy and what I express to all of my team members is that as the CEO of the organization, one, everyone in the world is my boss because I have to be responsive to people outside the organization. I don't have just one boss that I report to. And two, the way I run my organization, the way I've structured it is that I want my individual team members to know that my position only exists to help make them more productive at doing their jobs. And so I encourage my team to manage up. And if there's one person in my organization that is at the mercy of everyone else's schedule, it's actually me. I wanted to explore this a little bit further because not just as a pushback or an alternate perspective, but I really want to get your input and advice as to maybe I'm missing something and maybe it's something I need to look at more carefully within my own organization. You talked, an example you gave in your book or a subject area that you touched on was communications. And you talked about that when a manager or a boss provides communications maybe overnight or on the weekends to employees, that there's an implicit pressure on that employee to feel like they need to respond immediately. But from my perspective, my approach is that I'm using those after hours or before hours to basically stack the deck, to load up the guidance and the input and the leadership that my employees are going to need throughout the day and have it all there for them waiting and ready. And many of my team members on their own choose to operate at unique hours to perform their work. And I want to make sure that they're always accommodated and always productive because that's always there waiting for them. Do you think that I'm being short-sighted, and are there things happening or situations I'm creating in my own organization that you think I may not be aware of?
Okay, well, let me answer that question two ways. First of all, I think particularly being in Europe, you need to be cognizant of local laws because increasingly there's right to disconnect laws that actually make it illegal to communicate with people at certain hours. So you need to be aware of that so that you're on the right side of the law. Having said that, I think there's a real simple solution to this, and it goes back to the word that you started with, which was communication. I recently read something that Adam Grant wrote that I actually loved and put into my column. And it's a real simple thing that we should all do, but in particular, it would be great in the situation you're talking about, which is when you send an email to someone, and particularly if you're the boss and you send an email to someone and you are giving them information or asking them to do something that they need to respond to, also include at the end of the email when you would like them to respond by. And that can really, really help a lot of things because as Adam Grant pointed out, there's kind of a sense of urgency that often goes, particularly with things like Slack communications and texts, but to a lesser degree also with email. And often it's a false sense of urgency. So he said once, now of course he's Adam Grant, which makes him kind of excessively important in any situation, but he sent an email to somebody asking for something, and she emailed back, I think a couple of hours later, and began with a sentence, apologies for the delay. And he was like, what delay? You answered me pretty quickly here. And he said, we can all make ourselves much more and each other much more efficient if we say, I need to know the answer to this question by the end of the day tomorrow, if that works for you. Or this is really time sensitive. If you can take the time to do this right now and set aside another task, I would really appreciate it, which you obviously wouldn't do on a weekend. But I think that if we add that little bit, especially as the boss, of letting people know what the expectation is that goes with the email, then people would feel free to not even read the email if they're out hiking that day, for example.
Sure, sure. No, I think that makes great sense. And it allows me, in a way, to balance my own mental health with the environment I'm creating for my employees. Because, I'll be honest, I have an OCD streak. I always like to say on the OCD scale of 1 to 10, I'm a 7.9. And the for me, there's a mental health impact if I feel like there's something on my mind or something I'm not getting across. And I feel this sense of relief when I can get it out there in the universe, when I can send that email, when I can have that process started and take it off of my plate. But what you said, and allowing myself to unburden my mental condition, I don't want to create a burden on someone else. And I really liked what you said about using communication and timeline as the key. I also say that in our organization, one of our core values is there is no such thing as an action item without a deadline. And sometimes that deadline is needed to pull time in, but I love how you applied it in this case to push time out and give somebody a little bit more capacity and time to come back with a reasonable response on a reasonable time frame. I really appreciate that advice and perspective. I'm going to put it to work, and I hope that other members of the friends and family do as well.
No, thank you so much.
And one of the other things I want to ask about is when you create a culture and an environment, and I'm talking about some of these elements of my environment that I'm sharing with you, another one of the elements of our environment that I've talked about before, and I actually did a 4-part series on this so you can understand how important this is to me, was the notion of responsibility as a luxury and accountability as the price that you pay for it. And I try to instill this responsible, accountable mindset into my organization and the concept of extreme ownership, which we picked up from the Navy SEALs. And these things, what I have found, tend to be self-selective, meaning that people will self-select into our work environment when I'm transparent upfront about this type of environment. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you believe that there are mindsets or psychologies of individuals that may align better with this notion of sort of no divide between work and life? Do you think that there are people out there for whom that is actually a better fit and actually creates a better environment for them and their well-being?
Wow. Drifting back toward Elon Musk here. Well, once again, I don't think anything is one size fits all, but I also think, we're still, despite the massive layoffs sweeping through at least the United States, I don't know about Poland, we're still at a time of historically low unemployment. And people do still have more choice about where they work than at most times recent history. That said, people self-select into organizations for all kinds of different reasons. I want to work nights and weekends might be one for some people. I mean, it usually isn't framed that way. It's like, I want to work on something extraordinary. I want to get a whole lot done. I'm very ambitious. I want to, make a huge amount of money before I'm 40, whatever it is. People want all sorts of things. I think, again, because this is a period of historically low unemployment, and because there are a lot of brilliant people out there who wouldn't sign up for that as an employer, I think I would want to have a culture that allowed for some different gradations of that approach. I don't, if you want your whole organization, Elon Musk basically avoided a lot of layoffs at Twitter by telling people, my intention here is to work you to death and make you sleep under your desk. And a lot of people said, well, the heck with that. And off they went. And then later on, he said, we should probably hire some of these people back if they'll forgive me. Something. That wasn't quite the word he used. But, I don't think having only extreme workaholics in your company is necessarily a healthy thing for your company. I think it becomes really easy to lose perspective that way. That said, I'm not running a company, and I guess I ran ASJA, but that was a very different sort of organization with a lot of volunteer powers. So when you're dealing with volunteers as opposed to employees, it's not the same world at all. So, I'm speaking from no experience and you're speaking from lots of experience. So that's just my perspective, though.
No, I appreciate the perspective. Thank you. And, for me, I find that it goes maybe even a couple of steps further because everyone in my organization is an independent consultant. I have 0 employees in the company. Everyone is responsible for their own timeline and their own work product. There are several people for me, and it's interesting when you talk about historically low unemployment. One of the things that I think employment figures fail to take into account is people have multiple jobs. There are some people who are working for me as an independent consultant that it's their second, their third, their fourth gig. In the new gig economy, there are people working for multiple different organizations. And those individuals are choosing how much they're working and when they're working for each one of those different organizations. So I think that in this day and age, so many of these lines are getting blurred between who is really in charge at the end of the day and who is making these kinds of choices. And I'm seeing more and more that I'm not the one dictating the work environment to my team members. They're the one dictating to me when they're going to be most productive and when and how they're going to engage with our organization. And what I find is I try to create as flexible a platform as possible so that people can fit into it how they fit best, but always keeping that perspective globally within the organization of that responsible, accountable mindset along the way. Well, I appreciate all the discussion on that topic. End of debate. Really appreciated perspectives and appreciated everything you had to offer. And as I said earlier, I'm definitely going to take a lot of it into account and work it into my mindset and our organizational structure as well. I want to shift the focus now to community because I loved what you talked about. And this is actually in chapter 5 of your book. You said, if you follow only one piece of advice in this book, so my ears perked up when I heard that, please let it be this. You need community to support you in both your career and your life. You go on to say that this need for community is literally encoded into our DNA. Can you explain more about your research and your thoughts on these important topics? And Dadages, friends and family, that is where we will pick up in the next episode of Dadages. We will dig into many of the other aspects of career self-care, including community, mentorship, and sponsorship. Minda will share a lot more stories and a lot of knowledge. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, Dad may not always know what he's talking about, but he sure can sound like he does.